Hello there, welcome to Cool Talk. And today we're going to discuss the Celts. Now, almost everyone is familiar with the Romans and the Greek empires, but not the Celts. In spite of their taking over land from the British Isles all the way to Turkey. And one of the reasons is that the Celts never established a real empire. They were not unified. They weren't even one people. They were a number of clans and tribes, kings and chiefdoms, with similar customs and similar languages. Let's begin. Now, the Celts were expert farmers, and I mean real expert farmers. In Britain, over 2,000 years ago, the Celts could get a yield of 1.5 tons of food from 1 acre of land. This is better than Britain could do, as an average, in 1950. The Celts did not build stone buildings like the Romans and the Greeks. They built huge circular huts made out of timber, hatch, and mud. Tall huts, sometimes 50 feet high. They were masters of metalwork. It was perhaps the Celts who created the metal chain, armor made of metal rings. Their metalwork, their swords, their shields, armor was superior to that of the Greeks or the Romans. They were fierce warriors. They were vicious. They would chop off the heads of their enemies, embalm them, and keep the heads in their houses as souvenirs. And if you visited one of them for dinner, they would also invite you over to check out their head collection. They believed that the soul was in your head. So in collecting heads, they were collecting souls. The religious leaders were the Druids, who would advise the chiefdoms and prepare astrological calendars for them. Now, the Celts were tall, much taller than the Romans. Imagine, Julius Caesar was tall for a Roman, yet he was only 5'6". The Celts prided themselves in their physiques. If you were chubby, they would shame you into losing weight. Their hair was blonde and long. They would wash their hair with lime water until it was coarse, and they were very pale and very white. Now, in war, they would often fight naked, sometimes painting their bodies blue. And since they practiced human sacrifice, perhaps fighting naked was a way to offer themselves to their gods as a possible sacrifice of themselves. They didn't fear death, and before battle, they would chant and scream, scaring the bejesus out of their enemies. By 390 BCE, they had taken over the countries of Ireland, Britain, much of Spain, France, Austria, Switzerland, and went as far east as Turkey. And then they invaded Rome. Now, the Romans paid them a bribe so they could leave. So what did they do? They took the gold, plundered the city of Rome, and left. Now, why? Well, the Celts were not interested in cities like Rome with the stone buildings and temples. The Celts wanted land so they could farm. So they looted Rome and left. If they had stayed and had unified and consolidated their power, perhaps we'd be speaking of a Celtic empire instead of a Greek or a Roman one. And if that had happened, how would the world be different today? We can only speculate. Now, Celtic art was not realistic. It was abstract, expressionist. In the year 279 BCE, some interesting events took place. The Celts decided to invade the Greek Isles. Now, the Celts would ridicule the Greeks because the Greeks had statues of their gods, gods that looked like humans, not animal gods, not celestial beings, but humans. And the Celts found this ridiculous. How could a god look like a human? Well, the Greeks, fearing the Celts, began to pray to their gods. And when the Celts arrived, they were hit with snowstorms and earthquakes, and they left in confusion. Now, the Greeks claimed to have prayed to their god Pan, and from the word Pan came that frantic Celtic confusion known as panic. Unfortunately, the Celts had no written language, only oral traditions. To become a Druid religious leader took 20 years of study because you had to memorize everything. Now, some claim that these oral traditions kept other kingdoms from copying their ways. Being warriors, they built hill forts, that is, military compounds with walled areas. The maiden castle in the United Kingdom was a hill fort of 100 acres of land. There's very little archaeological evidence of these hill forts because the walls were made out of timber that, of course, does not last as long as a stone. So, anyway, the hill forts were carved on the hillsides. They enveloped the troops, but also enveloped huts, granaries, and storage huts and farms. I mentioned that the Celts were actually many tribal nations, and then they evolved and diversified. And there were also Germanic tribes, Caucasian warriors. We have the Gauls, the Goths, the Picts, the Slavs, the Anglos, the Saxons, different cultures. And I want to mention the Gaels. The Gaels were predominant in Ireland, Scotland, and Britain. Now, the Gaels had their language, and in Ireland today, you know that many people speak Gaelic, which is derived from that Celtic language. And now I want to pause and talk about another group, the Huns. Now, the Huns were not Celtic, but the reason I want to discuss the Huns is because, like the Celtic and Germanic tribes, they were a participating factor in the decline of the Roman Empire. Plus, they're an intriguing group, very prominent in the 4th and 5th century AD. The Huns were a nomadic pastoral people. They would herd cattle, yak, sheep. They would ride around on their horses. They would never get off their horses. They'd eat on their horses, sleep on their horses, sit around and socialize on their horses. They would eat a lot of meat from the herds of animals that they had, or they would gather food. And when food was scarce, they would drain some blood from their horses, boil it, and drink it. And people were afraid of the Huns. They were vicious, fearsome warriors. A Hun could ride past you on his horse at full gallop, turn around, and shoot an arrow right into you. They were deadly. And the greatest of the Huns was this leader, Attila, who ruled from 440 to 453 AD. And if you look at this map, you can see how much land the Huns had conquered. Now, Attila and the Huns raided and controlled the Germanic tribes of the Goths, the Gepids, the Rugis, and the Herules. Then they attacked the Celtic people, the Gauls. And Attila managed to raid and plunder the Gauls, but they were pushed back. And when they were in retreat, Attila became ill and died. After his death, the Hunnish Empire fell to inner squabbles and chaos. Yet the Huns, like other barbaric tribes, took refuge in the Roman lands, and with the excess of foreign influence assimilating into Roman culture, the Romans had declined. And now let's get back to the Celts. The Celts had extended their dominion across Eurasia. Now, how is it that the Celts, without writing, had such a similar culture in the far west and the far east? We believe it is because of the trade routes that they had. Celtic women were known for their height and their beauty, yet Celtic women also had more rights than any other culture at those times. They were equal to men at home, in politics, in commerce, and they made good warriors. By 300 BCE, the Celtics were riding high. They had peaked, but centuries later, they met their match in the Roman general Julius Caesar. Caesar was young and wanted to make a name for himself at the time, so he decided to attack the Celtic tribal nation of the Gauls in what is today known as France. These were the Gallic Wars that lasted from 58 to 50 BCE. Julius Caesar crossed the Alps with his army and entered Gaul, killing and enslaving as he went. But along came the Celtic leader Vercingetorix, who almost beat Caesar. He was from the Arverni tribe. He raised an army of poor Arvernians and took the city of Gergovia, crushing Caesar's army. But he also suffered heavy losses, so he retreated to the hill fort of Alesia. Caesar followed. He caught up and built a fortification around the city of Alesia. He boxed the Gauls in, but the Gauls had reinforcements coming, and when they arrived, Caesar had to build another fortification around his own troops for protection. It was like a donut inside of a donut, and Caesar was trapped inside. It would take Caesar's last reserve of troops and the last ounce of Roman resolve and relentless persistence to finally beat the Gauls. And Vercingetorix surrendered. He was imprisoned and taken to Rome. The 8-year Gallic Wars were over. 1 million Gauls were killed and 1 million more were enslaved. It would be the bloodiest campaign until the Napoleonic Wars that took place 2,000 years later. For the next 6 years, Caesar would take care of a civil war. When he finally had his triumphal procession, he brought out the Gallic king Vercingetorix, who was put in a cage and paraded around the streets, then taken before Caesar, who was sitting in a high chair, and he was strangled to death. Another Celtic nation was the Britons, and yes, you guessed it, it is Britain. Anyway, the Britons were taken over by the Romans in 43 AD, and they allowed an ally, King Prasutagus, to remain as king. The plan was that when he passed away, his daughters would rule the Britons along with an alliance with the Roman emperor. But when King Prasutagus died, his daughters were raped, and his wife, Boudicca, was flogged. But Boudicca gathered an army of Britons and fought back. She fought hard against the Romans, and she almost prevailed. In the city of London and 2 other cities, 70 to 80,000 people were killed in the wars, and Emperor Nero almost gave up, but General Suetonius defeated the Britons, and Boudicca and her daughters are said to have committed suicide. For over 400 years, the Romans dominated the Celts, and the Celtic culture almost disappeared, but it still persists today in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Now, the Romans eventually left Britain, but the Anglos and Saxons arrived to invade the Britain, and a Celtic warrior named Arthur stopped them, and from there came the legend of King Arthur and the sword of Excalibur. Around the 5th century, Irish pirates kidnapped a group of Britons, including a boy named Patrick. Now, Patrick would grow up to become a Christian missionary, and in Ireland, he is claimed that he had baptized thousands of people, ordained priests, and converted women to nunneries. Patrick is widely venerated in Ireland today. He is honored on March 17th each year on, you guessed it, St. Patrick's Day. Now, the Druids would be substituted by Irish monks. And because of the Irish monks writing everything down is the reason that we have some knowledge of the Celts today. So, despite the Celts dominating so much of Europe and Asia for so many centuries, their lack of vision diminished their influence, allowing the Romans to come in and substitute their power and their culture. Now, Celtic influence is still felt today in Ireland and Wales, the rugged individualism and refusal to bow to anyone. But then again, what would have happened if the Celts had had more vision, adopted writing, perhaps learned from other cultures? And what if they had not taken Rome's bribe in 390 BCE, so many years before? If there had been a Celtic empire and not a Roman one, what would have happened in Europe at that time? We can only speculate. The Celts respected women's rights, so what would have happened if women would have had equal treatment centuries earlier than they eventually did? And the Celtic empire that they did have was really a series of Celtic nations, so it would have been European countries rather than empires. And what about Britain? Britain may not have colonized the Americas, and who knows if we would have had a United States today, or if the United States would have been very, very different. The bottom line is we don't know. We can only speculate. But anyway, this is the end of the video, so please comment below, or better yet, subscribe. And my next video will be about the Middle Ages. Until then, thanks for watching. This is Cool Talk.